Hey you, I'm Brandy, the Quilter on Fire, and you are back. I'm so glad you're here. Today I'm going to show you how to bind a quilt with a pieced binding. And I'm in a hurry because I've got to send this quilt off in the mail. So let's go. Have you ever finished a quilt only to realize you don't have enough of the fabric you were planning for the binding? It happens all the time. Today I'll show you how a few fat quarters can turn into a pieced binding that will help you get that project done while adding a touch of charm. Before we get into the fabric, we need to talk a little bit about the sizes. We need to know the size of the measurement of the perimeter of your quilt. So that's the distance all the way around your entire quilt. We also need to know the size of your fat quarters, because sometimes those vary, and how many 2.5-inch strips you can get from each fat quarter. That way we'll be able to determine how many fat quarters we need to bind the entire quilt. So to figure out how much binding we need, here's where we need to do a little bit of math, but it's not too daunting. So the quilt that I'm going to bind is 75 by 75. So if you take all four sides and you multiply the 75 by 4, you come up with 300 inches. So now we need to figure out how much we need of our fat quarters. So I've got a bundle of fat quarters here. I'm definitely not going to need them all. I'll be choosing which ones I want to use, but let's figure out how many fat quarters we'll need. Whichever fat quarters you choose, you want to measure what size they are, and then we're going to count how many 2.5-inch strips we can get out of each fat quarter. So this fat quarter is about 18 by 22. So if we take the shortest side, which is 18, we'll cut it in that direction because we want the 22 inches as our length. So if we take 18 and we put 2.5 inches into 18, we'll be able to get 7 strips per fat quarter. When we're determining the amount of fat quarter strips we'll need, we have to remember that we'll have strips that are 20 inches long about. So let's just say they're 20 inches. So we have to remember that we're not sewing them together end to end. We're sewing them together by putting right sides together, and then we'll be sewing on the bias on an angle and then flipping it so that we have a nice bias angle there to reduce bulk. So we have to remember we're going to lose 2.5 inches off each end of each strip. So if you add that up on both ends, we're losing 5 inches per strip. So let's say we have 20-inch strips. We're going to add it up as if they're 15-inch strips. Now we have to see how many 15-inch strips we need to make a 300-inch perimeter of binding for our quilt. So we've got 300 inches for our quilt divided by 15-inch strips. So that's 20 strips that we'll need. And if we remember what we said, we'd get 7 per fat quarter, then 3 fat quarters will be plenty because 3 times 7 is 21. Now it's time to choose fabrics. So you don't have to have a huge stack like I have. We've already determined we only need about 3 fat quarters. So you could choose 3 that you love that go with your quilt, or you could change it up and you could go with 6 fat quarters, but just use half a fat quarter of each one. That way you have a greater variety of fabrics along your binding. So right now I'm choosing from these, and I think I'm going to split them up into light, medium, and dark. There's not much variation in light, medium, and dark here. They're very close together because they're all low volumes, but definitely this one's darker. And let's just take a look at how they're kind of laying out. I'm thinking the light ones are a little too light for this creamy quilt, and the dark ones, although they go with the backing really well, I think I like to have the medium tones. And I only need 3. So these 4 are kind of in the medium range of these low volumes. I think I'm going to choose the 3 with the geometric design, and we'll take the flowers out. So this is my final choice. Now it's time to cut them into 2.5-inch strips, and for that I use my AccuQuilt. I'm telling you, my favorite die of the AccuQuilt cutting system is my 2.5-inch die, and I use it every time I do a binding. Okay, now this is not a lesson or video on AccuQuilt. That's a whole other video, but I'm going to show you how I use my AccuQuilt because there are 3 distinct lines, 2.5-inch strips. You want to make sure your fabric's nicely pressed. I fold it in half. I can actually do all 3 of my fat quarters at the same time because you can have up to 6 on here. Today I'll just demonstrate one so that you can see I'm barely covering the edge of that line. I want to keep as much fabric as possible, have very little waste. But the reason I'm doing that is because there's only 3 strips. And I want to have this leftover fold at the end. I'm going to try to see if I can get my 7th strip, because we could fit 7 in 1 fat quarter. So let's get the cover and roll it on through. Double checking, it's all good to go. Pull it back for you, show ya. You can see that very thin strip that came off that side. I have 1, 2, 3 strips. And I have 1 strip that's bigger than 2.5 inches. Let's take those away, and then we just cut this strip so that it is also 2.5 inches. You can see that it just cut skinny little strips off either side, and we have our strip ready to go. Now that all our strips are cut, we're simply going to take them right sides together and join them on an angle. So let's spread one out. We got one here. We're going to take a second one, put it like this, and we're going to sew directly from corner to corner, and we're going to do them all in the same direction. So they're joined on the bias, and there's less bulk in our binding on the quilt. Another important point is you want to mix them up. So you could do 1, 2, 3 of the 3 different fabrics, and you're just alternating all the way along. Okay, now I've chosen 3 fabrics to piece together as my binding, and I'm doing them in order. So I'm doing swirl first, then straight lines, and then pluses. So that's the order I'm doing in. So right now I have a straight line in here, and I wanted to show you this part because I'm piecing them in a chain, okay? So you always want to make sure that the right side is up. When we piece these together, we're going to be crossing them like this. So I've got swirl, straight line, and pluses. So these little pluses are my 3rd fabric. You put them like this, completely perpendicular, you know, and then you make sure if there's selvage there, you're not including that in there. You want to let that selvage go. And you're going to turn it. Remember, right sides are together. You're going to turn it so that you're stitching straight across from this point to this point. So let me move my hand out of the way and show you that a little clearer. You're stitching straight across from this point to this point on a diagonal. So let's just go ahead and do that. Now when you're going to add the next one on in this chain piecing, you want to make sure you're flipping it over. So there's a little turn in your fabric. You got the right side up again, and then you add your next piece. So my next piece is the swirl. Again, I don't want this selvage in my quilt or in my binding. I'm going to turn it, and I'm going to stitch from this to this. You can literally just watch and go straight down to the other point. And then flip your fabric and get ready for the next one. And we're done. Now you cut them all apart, and then we're going to be pressing. As you snip the threads in between each piece, you want to just open them up like this to make sure that they're both right sides up, they're going in the right direction. You'll know you made a mistake immediately if you have an L shape or something wrong and they're not flowing in the right direction like this. So once you know for sure that right sides are up and they're in the right direction, then you can go ahead and snip off all of these triangles. So that's my tutorial on how to make a pieced binding. Now if you're wondering which way do I press the seams, I press them all to one side because if you press the seams open on a binding, it's less strong. It's stronger if it's pressed to the side, and your binding on a quilt is the first thing that will have wear and tear as your quilt ages. So you want your binding to be nice and strong. Also, this is a fun way to store binding until you're ready to put it on the quilt. I absolutely love collecting these old spools from vintage shops, and I wrap my binding around them until I'm ready to go. Thanks for joining me to learn how to make a pieced binding. If you want to see a full binding tutorial of how to get this binding onto a quilt, let me know in the comments. If you want that video, I'll make it. And if you found some good value in this video today, click on that thumbs up and share it with your friends. Bye for now. I'll see you next week.